Hey, everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We are excited to get things started here in just a minute. Today, we are going to be talking tree planting strategies. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping and some introductions. So I am Josh Bohunick with the Davey Resource Group based in the United States. And then we have Keith and Kenton with Trigonomics, who are the ones doing the primary presenting today.
Hello there.
I'll be your host. So today's webinar is being recorded. So if you have to leave early or couldn't make it or want to share it with a colleague, you should get a link to a recording at the end. We'll be doing questions and answers. Some of the questions we'll be able to answer throughout the presentation, but at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers as well. So there's a question and chat feature in your toolbar. You can go ahead and type your questions in there as they come up, and we'll read them out at the end and answer them. If you want, you can go ahead and tell us where you're calling in from. It's always interesting to see. So go ahead and type in maybe what city and country you're based out of. We are going to do some interactive polling during the presentation, just to help us understand who is out there and to better suit the presentation to you. So if you could answer those, just click on your screen when those pop up. That'd be great. And then there are several handouts as well that you can download. We'll put a PDF of the presentation up there, as well as a couple other references that we'll be giving throughout the presentation. So again, we look forward to having this interesting conversation on tree planting strategies. In the States, we call these urban tree canopy analysis, and excited to hear about how to make data-informed decisions on where to place trees as we try to reach our tree canopy goals. So we're going to start off with Keith with Trigonomics, and then we'll transfer it to Kenton. So we'll turn off our webcams here now so you can focus on the presentation, but we'll put them back on whenever we do some question and answers. So, all right, Keith, I think it's all yours.
Hello there. I'm assuming everybody can hear me, so we'll get straight into this. So once again, repeating what Josh just said, thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is about tree planting strategies and helping you achieve your canopy goals and other aims with regard to tree planting.
Keith, I think you need to share your screen real fast.
Sorry?
So go ahead and share your screen.
I think you're right. Hold on. Okay, and you will see my screen. Excellent. Okay, well, and I'm now not having my computer is not responding and moving the slideshow forward.
Just click on the presentation part, and then it should. There you go. Now hit your mouse key or your arrow key.
And I do apologize for this. No, my computer's not responding.
No problem, Keith. We can pull it up here. Kenton, do you want to pull yours up?
Yeah, I can share my screen in a moment. Hang on. Okay, hang on. Hang on just a moment. And then, Casey, just let me know when you want the slides advanced.
Okay.
Oh, I've got a big list of presenter names now. Hang on. Great. Thanks, Josh. Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, Ken. And move on next slide then, please.
That's really strange. Mine's not advancing either.
Well, boondog. All right, let me try mine then.
Okay, well, are you okay with that then, Josh?
Yeah, 1 second. All right, I think it's going. Just 1 second, there's a slight delay.
Hello, just talk amongst yourselves for a moment. There are embarrassing times when standing in front of people when the technology doesn't work. So here we are again, technology not working.
All right, we're good.
Okay, off you go. Next slide then, please, Josh. Thank you. Oh, yeah, right. Finally, we've arrived at the next slide. So the benefits of trees. I think this doesn't need to be dwelt upon many, but we're looking at trees in the urban environment. And many of you will be familiar with diagrams such as this that just illustrate the many benefits that are apparent for the trees delivering the urban environment, from stormwater runoff through to shade provision, health and well-being. But of course, there is a problem, and the problem is universal. It's not limited to the UK. It's one experienced everywhere in the urban environment. Generally, urban forests are an overlooked and undervalued resource. And what's staggering still is since the publication of Trees in Towns 2 in 2008, we still have 60% of urban forests in the UK that have no proactive management. But you then look at that and you say that significant percentage of the world's population are living in urban areas. So we look at it and we say that one of the solutions is tree planting. And tree planting, of course, it has to be recognised that the urban forest is dynamic. Trees will be lost and need to be replaced. And if we do nothing, then our tree populations in urban centre will decline. Very little replacement will be achieved through natural regeneration, and what most will be delivered through human agency, through planting programs. I think that's an inescapable fact. So it becomes important that the young tree planting programs need to be strategized. Otherwise, we get just a whole random series of plantings that have no linkages and no relationships to each other. So it seems to me a strategy for tree planting has several components. Each relates to the other, and the success of each is dependent on those component parts being successfully achieved. What we're suggesting here is these elements that you can see in front of you. Develop a vision. What is it you're trying to achieve and over what period of time? To set realistic targets and goals. What are you going to do, when and how? And then an action plan. Where to plant, what to plant, how to plant, management and maintenance. And most importantly, and I think significantly overlooked in the UK certainly, is this concept of monitoring and review. are we achieving what we set out to achieve when we set the program in place? So now we'll come to poll question 1. I'll hand over to Josh now to actually put this to you. If you can actually answer these questions or just select which of the questions is most appropriate. So Josh, over to you.
Yep, so we're just curious if you have a current tree planting strategy. So go ahead and get those votes in. We'll leave it open for just a second. Thank you again for bearing with us. I think we got it straightened out here now. Just maybe 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close it out and share those results. And it looks like about a quarter of the people, Keith, have one within the last 5 years. And then 50% kind of wish they did. So
It's interesting, that, isn't it? Wish.
All right. All right, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Is the slides going to change? Yes, here we are. So many of you will be familiar with this document, which was BS 8545, which was Trees from Nursery to Independence in Landscape, which was published in 2014. And one of the things myself and the drafting panel actually considered and looked at was this idea of a linear progression of considerations. For the document, we arrived at policy and strategy, site evaluation and assessment, species selection and procurement, nursery production, planting and maintenance, and review. Now that fitted in with the document, but I think what you've got there is a basic format for a tree planting strategy. What are the factors, what are the elements that should be included if we're going to make planting strategic? Here's the same thing illustrated graphically. So we start with policy and strategy. What do we want? What are we trying to achieve? From my perspective, one of the considerations that's always left out of such analysis is the nursery. The nursery's ability to supply, to actually deliver the trees that are actually required and necessary. We go through the handling processes, the storage of the trees down through to the planting, then management and maintenance, and going through to this point of independence where the trees that have been planted have actually grown to a size when they begin to deliver the services that can be that were reflected right at the outset in the diagram of the urban centre. And it's not until they reach this sort of size, and the one you're looking at in independence is a 1947 planting of plane trees in the Aldwych of London. I think what we need to remember is each of the component parts, and I'd ask you to actually make a note of that, the component parts that make up a tree planting strategy. And the intention is to examine each of those parts during this webinar. So if we can move on, you can again see that. I think that photograph perfectly illustrates some of the provision of trees. So here we are, the vision. This idea, what do we want to achieve? Not tomorrow, not in a fortnight's time, not in 2 years' time. What do we want to achieve in the long term? Now, this is a picture from the Dordogne in France. It's as you can see, a medieval township set into the hillside. There was a vision behind that construction. And then we have to look and realize that that vision can be multifaceted and will vary. And stakeholder involvement is essential. So if we look at these photographs here, we can see the archway of trained plane trees is from a place called Brive in France. The picture in the bottom left is the Memorial Gardens in Chicago. The top right is a London street, and the bottom right is a parkland, again in central London. The one in the centre is a bit extreme perhaps, but it can actually demonstrate and show some of the alternatives, some of the components that make up a planting strategy. What are we planting for? So as has been said, the vision can be singular, or multifaceted. And there are several elements with that, and none of these are intended to be a complete list. It's a guide to say, okay, there are all sorts of things that we can develop into our vision. So we can talk about increasing canopy cover, we can talk about increasing tree viability, diversity, we can talk about stormwater interception, and so on. But the key element with all of this is the piece in the last paragraph that said, an evidence-based assessment of what we have now. And I think that's critical within any planting strategy development is, why are we planting? And an understanding of what we have now, because without that understanding of what we have now, how do we develop a plan to where we want to be? And if we're talking about targets and goals, here's just a couple that have been extracted. They have no preference or no precedence, but I'm sure you've all in many ways been confronted with this type of thing. So we have Bristol, a new ambitious target to double the trees canopy cover by 2050. Do they know what the canopy cover is now? The government's tree planting challenge, 22,000 large trees and 28,000 small trees. What they mean by those particular descriptions, I don't know. From Thanet to Middlesbrough, Merseyside to Bristol. What trees? What species? Where are they going to be planted? Why are they going to be planted? What's hoped to be gained by it? UK's journey to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. What does it mean? And then the London Assembly, increased tree canopy cover by 10%. Where does that take us? What's the canopy cover in London now? How dispersed is that canopy cover? What's the variation between one of the London boroughs and its neighbours? What's the distribution of canopy cover within wards within the borough? And largely the answer would be, we don't know. So over to Josh then for poll question 2.
Yep, great. So when you're thinking about a tree planting strategy, I'm curious what your highest priority is. All right, looks like everybody's figuring out the polls, which is great. You're doing, Keith, you're doing well with the slight delay on the screens. All right, gonna close this out. Oh, this is fantastic, getting good voting here. Looks like it's pretty much tied between species diversity and environmental benefits, with climate change falling right up behind it.
I'm surprised that insects, pests and diseases doesn't feature more highly, Josh. I thought that would have been somewhat more topical at the moment. It's into, and so I'm going to carry on now. I haven't got control of these slides, so I'm actually going to be speaking over some and getting behind with others, so bear with me. But this is a picture from Columbus in the USA, and it's representative of what we see all over the place. There we are, we're going to plant 199 new street trees, and there's these wonderful graphics that actually illustrate what we're trying to achieve. But a question I would ask is, how many of these ambitious targets and good intentions actually come to fruition? So such targets and goals are to be welcomed and supported, but I think there's questions that have to be asked about them. How many targets are achievable? How many targets are set without a knowledge of what there is now? Commitments are made to increase canopy by a certain percentage without knowing what the canopy cover is now. And there are so many examples of this, particularly where it's become fashionable to actually make political commitments to do X, Y, and Z with relation to trees and to talk about numbers and percentages. And I'm not going to read through them all. You can all read, and a copy of this will be actually available to you afterwards. But I think it's possible to conclude that targets and goals are often just knee-jerk responses based on numbers and percentages, as opposed to any being related to any worked out strategic knowledge of where we are now and where we want to be. This idea of vision. What do we want our trees to deliver for us, and what do we have to do to get there? So here's a US planning document, and it states the first step to reincorporating green infrastructure into a community's planning framework is to measure urban forest canopy and set canopy goals. That's great. It's a brilliant starting point for sure, but there are limitations. These are two examples from case studies in the Trees and Design Action Group's document, Trees in the Hard Landscape. And I was fortunate enough to spend time in Melbourne with Ian Shears, who was then tree manager. And this coordinated approach to treescape and projects to double canopy cover, the information underpinning that is extraordinary. They have listed trees that may or may not be suitable for Melbourne's climate in 10, 15, 20, X number of years. So they have a complete picture of which species they might want to introduce when. They have a complete layout of Melbourne. Where are the priority zones? Where should they be planting? What they should be planting? How they can achieve diversity. So underneath that is a completely programmed and strategized methodology as to how they're going to get from where they are now to where they want to be. Similarly, the Seattle's Urban Forest Stewardship Plan follows similar lines. And within the same Trees and Design Action Group book, there's another case study by Frederic Ségur from Lyon. Frederick has achieved over the last 14 years a remarkable diversification of his tree population. Again, it started with a definite knowledge of where he was, and he's worked consistently and strategically over a number of years to arrive at the position now where I have a wonderful, wonderfully diverse population within Greater Lyon. So back to targets and about. It's this question of what are well-intentioned women, how many targets are based on real knowledge and understanding? And I think we're beginning to move in that direction in the UK. And a great example is the London Borough of Ealing report published in 2017. The diagram on the top right is Ealing's inventory. This is the Ealing-owned trees, the trees that Ealing are actually own and responsible to. The bottom one reflects the whole urban forest. Both were achieved using iTree Eco. Both had slightly different methodologies. The inventory report is a desktop exercise. The full community relies on sampling plots throughout. But what you have is you have a picture of the public sector trees, the private sector trees. You have a picture of how many trees. And this is completely unrelated to anything other than it's a fact of a warehouse. Now we'll assume it's Amazon's warehouse. And Amazon, whether you like them or loathe them, provide a highly efficient delivery service. I asked you the question, would Amazon begin to offer their service without having a prior knowledge of what they had, what was in stock, where it is, what they were going to do with it, and whether the mix, whether their product range was varied enough for them to be resilient in the marketplace? I think the outcome would almost inevitably be, no, they wouldn't. So why do we do that when we're managing our tree populations? Why do we often overlook this idea of what we've got and how we're managing it? So the next question is where to plant. And again, this is one of the factors that's always or often missing with the idea of not planting by numbers or planting by percentages. Some questions. What's the total planting space available? Very often that's unknown. what's the total stocking level possible? So within the population that you have over a geographical area, how many trees could we plant before it was actually full? You couldn't get any more trees in it. Which areas where planting is possible should be prioritised and why? Then there'll be many factors involved in that in terms of environmental necessity, environmental equity, levels of poor human population health, a lack of leisure facilities, pollution on transport routes, and again, identifying and engaging with which communities would benefit most from tree planting. Do we know? Do we talk to the population? And what's the condition of the existing tree population? And identifying where succession would be necessary. So again, this idea of succession, do we actually arrive at the point where we are planning for the inevitable decline of the mature trees? Are we already underplanting with trees which will be the replacement trees? And then what to plant? I think it's this idea of, there are so many considerations, but personally, I hate the term the right tree in the right place. Because what does it mean? Define it. It's open to all sorts of interpretations that may not have any evidence base behind them. So what does it actually mean? And I don't know. I've struggled with this one since it came into popular circulation and still actually do struggle with it. So I think there's lots of considerations about what to plant. The diversity within the existing population, how resilient is it to imported pest and disease? How can planting increase diversity and resilience? Which species will thrive given the likely impacts of climate change? And this is often overlooked, is which species have inherent tolerances that are genetically adapted because of where they grow in nature to thrive in the urban environment of both now and the future? Which species have the capacity to deliver specific ecosystem services? We had a stab at this. Kenton did a great piece of work for Bartram Trees, where he actually looked at the individual capacity of species to deliver specific ecosystem services, which provide these services. And again, you're looking at on the photographs, you can see species that are really not terribly well used, certainly in the UK urban environment, yet all have a capacity to deliver. And one of the elements is this question of whether tree nurseries can actually, not only the numbers required, but the species required, because nurseries tend to be habitual in what they produce. They produce what sells. If the palette of what's being asked for is relatively small, then they will continue to grow a relatively small palette of trees. For instance, carrier. I live in Lewes in Sussex. There's a carrier growing quite happily in my garden now. There's a Celtis australis just outside the door. And I know of 2 local diasporas, but they're relatively unconsidered species. And of course, you've got what the preferences of the local community. John Flanagan did some wonderful work at Somerset for his PhD, where he actually questioned the community. What did they want from their tree population? Was it aesthetics? And largely it was shape, form, colour. And here's a tree that's just hardly ever used in the UK. This is from Dresden in Germany, not Dresden as is typing, which is the well-known typing error. But these trees apparently survived the bombing. They go around the inner ring road of Dresden, very small number now, but the plan from Dresden is to actually include Stiphonolobium around the whole of the inner ring road of Dresden with new planting to recreate this. But the tree is hardly ever used in the UK, yet and of course it has a foliar appearance and structure not dissimilar to ash. So again, we have to question the species we're using. Then we come on to, in our linear progression, how to plant. And what we're looking at is a simple question. What do trees need to succeed following planting? And here's a picture of Colrateria growing in the streets in Germany, quite happily. And the answer to that question of what they need is in reality not that much. Air, water, space for root development. Obviously, they need room for crown development above ground, but most problems are below ground, and it's in that order: air, water, root space. So there's a huge amount of advice out there. I've already mentioned the Trees and Design Action Group, and here's 2 of their publications. There are several more, and a couple of other of many that are on the environment. I would recommend Trees in the Hard Landscapes, which will be available as a download after, particularly the case studies, which offer extraordinary advice. And here we come on to the so often it is got so wrong. This is a shot from Sweden. The community decided that they would like a tree-lined avenue demarking a shall we say, a superimposed cycle lane. Well, I would ask the question, are those trees ever likely to achieve longevity in the landscape? I think unlikely. But it can also be got so right. These are shots from Stockholm. Those are in continuous strips of structural soil which run along the footpath. Structural soil, I'm not going to know what's right, what's wrong. Structural soils can be structural soils stone-based as used in Sweden or Stockholm, but also many of the underground cellular systems provide exactly the same solution. So it's how we plant the trees. And then we come on to management and maintenance. And I've just loosely put this one. Another tree grid strangles another tree. And I'll wager wherever you're sitting today, if you walk less than half a mile from your home, you will find it very easy to photograph things like this. There we have the tree guard put on to protect the tree, and you can see what's happening to the tree. The guard is there and is actually probably going to be the thing that kills it. And as I say, you don't have to work terribly hard to find examples such as this. This birch tree has obviously made certain growth adaptations. And I can imagine this planting scheme cost an absolute fortune. That's advanced nursery stock. I would say that they're 20, 25, 30 centimetre girth trees. They would probably cost in the region of £250, £300 each. Have a look along the line, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out the amount of money that's just been spent on trees alone. So you have to think, where was the strategic thinking behind that in terms of species choice, planting, measurement, monitoring of development? They're all questions, but they're all part of this. They're all part of a strategic approach. And then we look at this idea of legacy. We're doing it for the future. So here's a couple of typical car park planting schemes, and that's what we're getting. That's what we're delivering, because plantings are randomized. There's no strategic overview or thought that goes into them. So Josh, poll question 3, please.
All right, thank you, Keith. Always good, Keith, to get those pictures of tree planting gone well and not so well. But what are your primary barriers to tree planting? All right, a couple more seconds here. Interesting, Keith. It looks like it's surprising that it's a lack of prioritization to me.
Really? Yeah, I would agree. I would agree, Josh. That does surprise me. But again, lack of prioritization really just reflects us back to the need and necessity for trees planting strategies, so that planting priorities can be communicated not only to the community but to the politicians and others, so everybody has a clear understanding of why what is being planted where. And then we come on to this idea of monitor and review. And again, I don't know of anyone in this country that successfully monitors and reviews tree growth. If there's somebody that does, I would be delighted to hear from them and understand how they achieve it. Here are some guides, measures you can use: increase in stem diameter, extension growth produced annually, foliage size and colour, crown size and uniformity, anticipated growth. It's not fully comprehensive. There are others, and others could be developed. I'll go back to Melbourne. In Melbourne, young trees are audited independently. There is a set range of criteria that the auditors use. The auditors are independent of both the local authority and the contractor that planted the trees. The trees are assessed. Did they meet the criteria, or do they meet the criteria that the local authority set out at the inception of the planting scheme? And it's remarkably successful. So the purpose of value of a comprehensive tree planting strategy is that it pulls together all the threads which have been discussed so far today. So there is uniformity in planning, a clear vision articulated, realistic and achievable targets and goals, not the whimsical knee-jerk percentage targets and number targets, suitable and appropriate species selected, liaison with the nursery, informed planting techniques specified and adhered to, appropriate management and maintenance is programmed, and progress is monitored and reviewed. Then we know whether we're actually going to achieve or we're working towards the targets that we set ourselves. So there we are. I hope that element's been useful to you, because I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Kenton Rogers, who will talk about a specific set of work that Trigonomics is actually undertaking with the London Borough of Islington. Thanks for listening, and hope to talk to you again at question time.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I hope you hang on for questions, because there's been quite a few in for you specifically as well, which is great. There's been a lot of questions coming in. And it was good to hear your insights as well. It's good to always learn something when I hear your talks.
Thanks for that.
So yeah, as an example, we're just going to look at some work we completed in Islington, with Islington. And just for those of you who don't know, Islington's a London borough, the north of the Thames. It's highlighted in that map there on the left. And the tree planting strategy really is just part of the wider urban forestry programme in Islington. That isn't just us, there's lots of other people involved too. So we started with the urban tree canopy cover assessment, and iTree Canopy is one of the ways you can do that, but this was actually done using Blue Sky National Tree Map data. Other aerial imagery is available, and remotely sensed data, and some of that is free as well. But that just gives us this overview of this extent of the current urban tree canopy cover. What have we got? And this can be calculated for each ward as well. And this is something that iTree Canopy can do, actually, is this ward assessment. And we're looking at iTree tools in the next webinar. But, you know, the canopy cover of Islington's pretty good compared to the London average, which is around 21%, which compares pretty well to other areas in the UK. But there's quite a large disparity across the wards, ranging from just 13.9% in Bun Hill, down there in the bottom, to 36.7 in Hill Rise. So basically, there's little point planting trees where you already have good coverage, but because a lot of well-to-do people live there, that can be a place where often more trees tend to be planted in the areas that already have good tree coverage. And I was speaking to John Ryan this morning, and he said this, that map is a great tool for councillors to show them the tree coverage in each ward. So it was a good way to highlight the disparity at course resolution, where to plant trees, but it's also evidence to lever the funding required for tree planting and tree plant strategies. And of course, yeah, councillors love it because, it's just a picture. Separate to that, but also key, is finding all the hooks for trees in a policy review. And, right from the very top, looking at the sustainable development goal level, right the way through the local planning. Trees can help meet a lot of these key performance indicators or targets that have been set. And again, that gives John Ryan, the tree officer, another hook in to lever funding for tree planting. Where are trees going to help meet policy objectives? Next slide, please, Josh.
It's coming.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so yeah, local planning can also be looked at, and then using that, you can identify areas for development and KPIs for increasing tree cover, and it's more of a lever really when you can link trees into all these different policies from international level, national level, right the way down through to a very local level really. And so that also helps get the funding for tree planting, but also tree planting strategies and opportunity mapping. So taking the canopy cover surveys one step further, there's a whole range of data you can get from the Office of National Statistics and environmental data, because you don't want to plant trees in the same places, but also you can target your tree planting in places where it's going to have the biggest bang for buck, I guess. So we looked at data on life expectancy, house prices, GCSE results, crime rates, urban heat island effect, air pollution and flooding, and identified which of those are important for Islington, because flooding isn't an issue in Islington. And they can all be overlaid in a GIS environment, and then you can target the planting to the areas that most need it. And here we can see that in the GIS environment, and that can be used to produce then a tree planting heat map based on a multi-criteria analysis, which is based on local need, because further down the road flooding is an issue. So primarily for Islington, the tree planting is focused in areas with low canopy cover, high social deprivation and high pollution. But obviously we don't want to plant trees under existing tree canopy cover, and we want to try and plant those trees in soft plantable areas, because they're the quick wins. And there was a question earlier, came up earlier in the poll about canopy cover goals. What's a realistic canopy cover goal? And it very much depends on what you've got locally. How much area have you got to plant new trees? Because you don't want to set a canopy cover goal that you can never obtain. And I know famously, I think Boris, the previous London mayor, announced a canopy cover goal for London. I forget what it was, but this was before they even knew what their existing canopy cover was in the first place. He just went ahead and announced they were going to increase it to this percentage in 5 years. And then the London tree officers were like, oh gosh, we've now got to measure it quickly because we don't know, didn't know how much they had. So here's an example of that priority mapping, showing the potential plantable space, which across Islington is around 22%. But this is potential, yeah. This is everything. Actual plantable space is different, and that excludes all the private properties, and is a much lower figure. And the mapping showed clearly the priorities for which is most desirable and achievable to plant first, the quick wins, and it's not a shortcut to thinking. This is a decision support to help the tree officer then direct skilled resources for all the important site-specific stuff. And I've just thought I'd share this quickly with you. It's another resource from the Trees Design Action Group, and it's about helping to inform species selection. And all credit to Dr. Andy Horrens and Henrik Schoeman from Sweden, and Andy's from the UK, in compiling this. It lists over 350 pages of logically and hyperlinked, indexed species profiles for well over 250 trees. And you can select the trees based on various criteria, aesthetics, or constraints, or ecosystem services. So we've got a link to that as well that will go out after the webinar, in addition to the TDAG publication, which should be in your handouts section there in the toolbar. So here's an example of that species profile. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Next slide, please, Josh.
It's interesting you guys call those lime trees. We call them lindens.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is the Old English name. I don't know what happened, because the Old English name for hazel is European, is filbert, and you've still got that name, and at some point we changed it to hazel. That happens a lot.
It was about the time Robin Hood became American.
Next slide, please, Josh. So I'm looking now at what's next for Islington, having identified where to plant, and targeting where to look to plant. It's about ground proof checking, all that. And that's a job that needs to be done by the tree officers. The suitability of those potential tree planting areas, really needs to be individually assessed. There's going to be a lot happening on site, such as overhead utilities, underground utilities, which are going to prevent tree planting, and other site-specific factors really that are going to determine what's best to plant. And that does really need to be done by local people on the ground, consultants or the tree officers. Community engagement program. So this is really important, because engaging the community once tree planting sites have been identified is essential. Residents, local businesses, utility companies I've just mentioned, they're going to be more likely to cooperate with the planting of trees in the borough, and they're going to be more likely to maintain and nurture those new trees if they've been involved. And this example here is taken from the internet. It's the urban forest web map that Islington have developed. And the great thing about doing all that GIS work on the canopy cover and the tree planting opportunity mapping is that it's really easy then to convert that onto a website to demonstrate to members of the public, where are my trees, how are my trees doing, what species have I got, what condition are they in, am I in an area where there's high social deprivation and low tree cover. And so I haven't got time to go into that now, but we're going to send you a link to that as well, so you can have a look in your own time. And similarly, other people have got those. There's the Ealing have one that you can look at, a web map. And so just quickly wrapping up, if you wanted to hear more on Islington, John Ryan's going to be speaking at the 3rd European iTree Conference in Amsterdam. And I was speaking to him this morning, and I'm hoping he's going to be talking at our next webinar as well, which is on the 16th of July, which will focus more on the iTree tools. And Scott Mako from the US iTree team and Davey will be on that one as well. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed listening to that. And now we're going to be available to answer some of the questions that have been coming in.
All right, great. Thank you, Kenton and Keith. So there's a lot of questions here. If we don't get to everybody's question, we'll answer individually at the end, or follow-up email. But Keith, here's a tough one right out the bat for you.
Thank you, Josh.
Says I work in a local council and they don't have a tree nursery. What would be involved in establishing a council-run nursery, or would a community-owned nursery be a viable alternative?
I'm asked this question repeatedly. I think a community tree nursery, if the intention is to produce from seed small trees 60, 90, 91, 20 that are untrained for planting in large numbers within the community, I think that's perfectly viable, perfectly acceptable, and readily achieved. The problem that usually occurs is they're set up by a group of enthusiasts, and when one or two of those main enthusiasts move or move away, then the the effort and direction of the tree nursery often fails. I would urge caution, though, in moving into or asking for local nurseries, this is community nurseries, to produce 810s, 1012s, 1214s. Whether local authorities could do it, well, when I first started in local authorities, we did it. And we had our own nurseries and we grew trees at the authority I worked with. We bought in trees at 4, 6, 6, 8, grew them on in the council's nursery, carrying out all formative pruning, and we had them to a condition that we wanted before taking them out and planting them in the streets. The sad problem is most local authority nurseries no longer exist. And we had a nursery where we produced all our own shrubs, all our own trees, all our own bedding plants, and a whole range of decorative plants for the mayoral functions and things like that. Sadly, that nursery no longer exists. And I know from experience, many of, particularly in London, almost every local authority in London had a very, very accomplished nursery with highly trained staff. Again, the skills have gone. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up question. Here in the States, we have quite a few local communities that will do different initiatives around that, but also we have a growing concept of contract growing,
Yes,
where the city will commission 10 years of trees and pay for them up front, to stuff like that. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think, again, if we're strategic management and planning of planting allows budgets to be projected forwards against aims and objectives. Species diversity, to achieve it fully, is going to have to be done with the cooperation of nurseries, because the incentive for nurseries to grow and produce difficult species where there's only speculative demand or no demand at all is unlikely to occur. Working under contract, then nurseries will begin to be more adventurous and actually begin to grow some of the unusual and different species that are going to be required in the urban environment just to respond to climate change and pest and disease. So personally, I think it's part of the cooperation program, and the key to that is a planting strategy. If there's a planting strategy that is programmed out 4, 5, 10 years in advance, then there's the room to work with the nurseries, there's room to forward produce. I always remember going to New York very early in their million tree planting campaign, and one of the first things they did was introduce contract growing. They wrote very clear specifications as what they wanted, what species they wanted, what form they wanted, what size they wanted, what condition they wanted. And then they employed several nurseries, not around New York, but across the US, to produce those trees for them. Because their target, they set themselves a target of planting 22,000 trees, street trees, in New York annually for a 10-year period. And I believe they met that target as well.
Yeah, they did. Here's a go, Kenton. Someone says they've read in some research that we should also take into consideration a sort of fixed % of tree substitutions per year to avoid less problem with veteran trees and streets and to boost ecosystem services. Is that something that we should consider in our urban forestry strategy?
definitely. I think there's a balance to be struck, and it's important to maintain your existing trees and also your oldest trees, and manage your veteran trees as well, providing they're not posing an adverse risk, but in all likelihood, your veteran trees will be in areas where there's more room for them to have got to that size in the first place. The difficulty comes when you've got novel pests and diseases coming in, I guess.
So similarly related to that, there's a lot of talk about what size tree to plant. What's your thoughts on, should you plant smaller stock as they establish quicker than larger stock? And what is your preferred size for planting stock?
Do you want to go first, Keith? Or
Yeah, I mean, Josh, I think it's horses for courses. I think you have to really be considering the site you're planting, how quickly you want to achieve effects, how important they are, and then select the stock, and very often it's assessing the quality of the stock you're buying and understanding the production system behind that quality of stock, and then appreciating that the maintenance and management of larger stock is invariably going to be more and more intensive in those early years after planting. But I genuinely feel it's understanding the production system from which you're buying. If you're asking for a personal preference, I would always plant small. But if you're thinking about a highway planting, I would suggest to you a 60-90 whip along a highway is not going to be terribly successful. So again, it's this balance between what you want to achieve and where you're planting, but understanding the nursery production system to ensure that the material you're buying, irrespective of its size, is actually produced to a level and standard that you can actually be sure that that stock is in the best possible position to actually take its place in the landscape. Kenton?
yeah, I agree. It's a question of where you're planting. I mean, in some urban areas, you can actually, you can actually still use natural regeneration if it's the right, if you want those trees in that place, on a disturbed site. I know some places have looked at that and they've actually thought, well, yeah, why not have the sycamores and birch for a while, because they're the ones that are growing best and we just have to go and thin them out. But that's obviously in a larger woodland open space disturbed site sort of urban area, rather than in a street where you probably would want larger trees, because wasn't there the big tree plant scheme, but it was kind of geared towards, you could only really plant small trees, and that raises issues because they're easier to damage, aren't they? And
yeah, I think it takes you back to the second element of BS 8545. The second element there is site evaluation and constraints. What site are you dealing with? What's the potential of that site? What constraints are there on that site? How many of those constraints you could ameliorate? Which constraints are you left with, and you're still going to, and then you choose your species to actually and size to actually overcome the constraints that you can't remove. And I think that's the way you should process it, rather than having a preference for a size or species from the outset, because you're trying to create something that will succeed and achieve longevity and the solutions. And I Jeremy Barrell summed this up quite nicely for me when we were working on 8545. He suggested that what we've got to realise that this whole subject is an intellectual process. It's riddled with choices, and you make those choices from an educated perspective. So you understand, starts with the vision. What do you want to achieve? Then how are you going to achieve it? What do you need to do? And the choices are going to be, endless. And size of planting material is obviously one of them.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that thing around, what we've been looking at in Islington is very high level stuff, at quite a grand scale. And when you get right down to the site specifics, that's where you need an arboricultural consultant to
Absolutely.
assess the site, not use the decision support as a shortcut to thinking. And the Arboricultural Association and the ICF all have lists of those.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Kent. It becomes young tree management has always been, in my view, a specialism, and it's not recognised as such. But I've always felt it is a specialism.
Fantastic, guys. So we're up on the hour here. There's so many good questions coming in. I wish we could sit around all day. Maybe we'll ask just this last one, and then if we could answer it shortly, because I think it's important. It's talking about estimating future canopy and potential canopy increases. Do you guys have a good methodology or a way to do that? There were several questions asking that. Any thoughts on estimating future canopy?
Kenton, do you want to talk about break even?
No, I think we'll stick with future canopy for now. Yeah, just to answer the question. And in the next webinar, we're going to be talking more about the iTree tools. And I know there's in iTree design, you can grow canopies out. That's at a more site-specific scale.
Folks might like to look out some presentations. I think they were arboricultural session delivered by Matthew Wells from Santa Monica, and Matthew has a planting program that actually extends 10 years into the future. And Matthew actually looked at this in terms of canopy. So he started off from the point as, okay, my population is dynamic. I'm going to lose trees every year. Those trees are likely to be large trees, and I'm planting with smaller trees. So how many trees do I need to replace the ones I've lost numerically? And then how many trees do I need to plant to actually increase canopy? But what he did reflect on was that he's not going to increase canopy immediately. So there's going to be canopy decline before you actually get to canopy gain. So young planting is not an instant solution to canopy cover gain. But again, the importance of strategic thinking is when you begin to see, okay, if I lose 100 and I plant 400, at some time in the future, if all those trees reach maturity, I'm going to get canopy gain. And that's the realistic, and that's where you can actually start talking about arriving at a point in time when you've achieved that canopy gain. But it's not 2 years or 3 years, as is suggested some of the targets now. It's a long-term strategic overview with a plan to take you from stage 1, where you are now, through to where you want to be.
Yeah, and of course, sorry, just reminded me then whilst you were speaking, Keith, about Ealing, because they were one of the first to use the forecast tool within iTree Eco, which will model canopy cover growth
Absolutely
over the next 30, 40, however, and you can input that time horizon, and you can input the mortality rates and disease and storm events into that as well. And you can do that for a do nothing scenario, business as usual scenario, and an ideal scenario. You can go on ad infinitum with different scenarios, planting different tree species or just leaving it as is, and seeing how the canopy improves or deteriorates, because it's quite an interesting dynamic, because you get these curves and plateaus from when there's been planting initiatives in the past, like plant a tree in 73. There's still that in the system. It's interesting stuff, but it warrants a lot of time, to look at.
You can also pick up... Go on, Josh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say another element is in iTree Canopy, you can do historical analysis. So you can look at how much your canopy has grown from the previous, go back in time a little bit. And that's kind of interesting, particularly if you overlay rates of development and future planned growth. You can start to get some insights that way.
Yeah, and then the nice thing about Canopy is it's quick, it's cheap, it's easy, and all the tutorial stuff's online as well, so you can just get on and do it.
Great. Well, again, there's so many good questions here. We could have done an hour just of questions and answers. Maybe next time we'll just put one slide up and then just take questions. But good stuff. Thanks so much for everybody for bearing with a couple of the tech problems at the beginning. Appreciate that. We'll get back to all these questions that are in here for the good of the person that answered them or asked them. You should get a link to a recording. If you don't get that, let us know. We can send you a link. You should also get a follow-up survey asking what you think of how we did here. And we have another one coming up talking about iTree next in about a month. So several register for that already. And then we'll finish with Trees, People, and Technology in August as part of the summer webinar series. So again, thank you everybody for hanging out today. And I hope you have a good one. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheerio. Bye. Bye.